The headlines of the most recent times was Egypt's protesters, best protesters, worst Democrats. And clearly this has held much controversy in recent times. And the reason for this is because the controversy had come because many media sources, such as The Guardian, have stood strong towards stood strong towards optimism in Egypt, stating that there is a chance for democracy if the process is held strategically correct, while other media sources, such as the New York Times, have stated, well, that's not going to be the future. It's going to take much more than a few decades for them to actually gain stability and become democratic. But when focusing on this, we have to understand that this makes reason for us to believe that unfortunately the Arab Spring has continued and is especially volatile now more than ever. And therefore we can see that economically we saw that in 2011 their economy had found themselves at a downfall. However, now more than ever, we're going to see that politically this is going to be the agenda of Egypt's parliament and its current cabinet. And therefore, focusing on democracy is going to be a key issue. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves today's question. Is Egypt headed for a liberal or democratic future? And the answer to this question is fortunately yes, for the following three reasons. First, because of the United States' funding to the Egyptian military. Secondly, because of Egypt's current cabinet standing. And lastly, because we're going to notice that anti-Morsi protests have succeeded in centralizing their power. So first, what we're going to notice is that fortunately the United States' funding has held strong towards the Egyptian military. And the reason for this is cleared up by a Reuters article dated July 17, 2013 that stated that the United States' current military aid of $1.7 billion annually has actually caused the Egyptian military to hold down a civil war by taking down Mohamed Morsi and usurping it. Indeed, the article went on to report that if in fact the civil war had begun and the military had not took its strategic standing as it did, the way it did, the country itself would be at end. The government itself would not stand the way it is, and therefore the government itself would not get the $1.7 billion funding, and that in itself would take down the military itself by means of cuts that would be so significant. And therefore the United States is pushing its influence by means of its funding in Egypt. We have stated, according to the Brookings Institution of July 16, 2013, that we weren't going to pick sides on this issue. However, the United States, in fact, has seen itself pushing for a more democratic side by its funding. Indeed, John Kerry had actually stated that he was not going to, that he was going to cut funding if in fact there was a civil war in Egypt, and basically that's a threat towards the Egyptian military as they rely so heavily on the United States' funding. And therefore we can clearly see that the United States' funding has pushed the Egyptian military to push for a more liberal and democratic way, and therefore our influence in Egypt has prevailed in the long term. Secondly, what we're going to focus on is the current cabinet standing for Egypt. And unfortunately, many Egyptians are unhappy because according to an Al Jazeera report dated just yesterday, they went on, the Egyptian Islamists have no stand in the Egyptian parliament, or the Egyptian cabinet, zero. And unfortunately, this has sparked much controversy as women technocrats and Christians have a larger standing than Islamists themselves. And running under a theocracy, which is a government run under religion of Islam, has actually sparked much controversy with the government not being run by its own people. However, this has a strong standing for democracy. As a report from the New York Times dated July 15, 2013 report that fortunately for the situation, when looking at it, we can clearly see that Islamists within the area would encourage Muslim Brotherhood and rival Salafists, and indeed both of them have anti-democratic ideals, and therefore it's beneficial that the United States does not have the Islamists within their cabinet, because that would in fact give the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafists hope for the future. And unfortunately, that is not the case for them. And therefore, we can clearly see that democracy has thus begun to diminish. Now, furthermore, when having less Democrats within the system, we see a benefit for the United States, clearly because, as the standings show, there is less al-Sharia within the system, as we will talk in our third point. Which brings me to my third point of analysis, which is that anti-Morsi protests have become more strong, or rather, has become stronger in the long term than that of the pro-Morsi protests. Indeed, protests have begun causing way for civil war pleas by both sides. Both sides have attempted to push themselves over the edge, and unfortunately, this has only prevailed for the anti-Morsi protests. And the reason for this is simply made by an article published by the Washington Post, dated July 14, 2013. That reports that, fortunately for the according to that report, we see that anti-Morsi protests, or rather pro-Morsi protests, have begun prevailing the ideals of pro-Morsi protests have begun of the al-Sharia. And al-Sharia is anti-Western ideals, which is basically anti-democracy. And therefore, with anti-democracy spreading throughout the region, we can clearly see that because the pro-Morsi protests have begun to diminish and haven't had a centralized power, this clearly stands as a benefit for democracy. And therefore, for the three reasons that we've discussed, and therefore we have to ask ourselves,